Hello everyone, it's great to be here and thanks to Hannah and Leibniz-Institut for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to come to your institute. There's lots of overlap and I won't repeat things that Jan has said hopefully, so I'm going to just talk about a few things. I want to sort of give you a bit of background to where I'm at the moment, which is I've become incredibly worried about where we are in the world, and I think like many of us this has been a very sort of difficult year politically. And so I decided that I wanted to go back to a place that I'd worked in about 10 years ago, which was a street market area in London called Queen's Crescent, and kind of revisit it, because what it seems to me at the moment is the case that there's a very negative, at least in Britain, discourse towards migrants. And this is the kind of context within which we're working. And I suspect Germany seems to be one of the few countries where you've got a kind of president who's, trying to be welcoming to migrants. It certainly isn't the case in Britain at the moment. And so that's quite, in a way, a challenge for us thinking about the kinds of questions that have been raised by us today. So I thought, well, I want to sort of make a different intervention from perhaps what I did 10 years ago, because when I looked at this issue 10 years ago, I was kind of interested in the tensions in this particular area. I wanted to go to this area and think about how does it work. Because I live near this area and I think it works. I can see it works, if you see what I'm saying. It's an everyday space which actually, to me, is vibrant, and if you walk down the street, you see all sorts of, people living together in fairly harmonious, it seems, ways. So I thought, okay, let's think about that. And the result of that was a paper which has just come out in ethnic and racial studies called Makingmulticulturalism. So I got interested in this idea of how do we make the multicultural? Let's see that as a productive process. Let's see it as a constitutive process rather than, in a sense, take it for granted. And so that's the background. And I did this by all sorts of research methods. I'll come to that at the end of my talk. So I went back to this area optimistically hoping that my superficial observations, which is that this place seems to work, does it work, was my question. And I suppose in brief, I said yes. That was rather kind of nice, because at the moment when, over half of the population seemed to be voting to get out of Europe because of, it seemed fueled by sort of anti-migrant status, what you find in London is the opposite. 70% of Londoners actually voted to stay in Europe. And this is an interesting point. It's an interesting argument because, again, it goes back to perhaps what Felicitas introduced me with, the quote, because it seems to me, and seems to a lot of us, that living with difference actually produces forms of accommodation. Separation from difference seems to produce kind of hostility. So cities, in a sense, are the very places within which this kind of accommodation of difference seems to work. And I find that an optimistic thing. I think that's a very optimistic thing. So probably what we should do is flood this countryside with migrants and finally people get used to the idea that they're not going to completely ruin everything. So that's a little bit of a rave, but I feel quite strongly about these questions at the moment because I think they're serious questions to consider. Various kind of questions were asked to us to think about. If you look at institutional practices of regeneration, on the whole, I'm quite sceptical about them at the broad brush level. We have a lot of regeneration in Britain. We've had it over the last, many years really. And unfortunately, and I like the take that you're producing, this sort of migrant-led regeneration, because when we think about the term regeneration, it's never linked with migrants. I find that quite a novel approach, and I think I'd like to sort of take that on and rethink from that perspective my own work. Government regeneration policy is more or less frequently hand in hand with private developers, and therein I think lies the problem of regeneration in cities, because it's about making profit out of land and housing, and that's how it's been. So in capital cities, and I think the ones I've studied anyway, generally speaking, it's had very negative consequences for migrants. and particularly because of the kinds of points that Jan makes about the informal sector being an important sector for migrants. It just has always been the case that migrants, especially, I mean, there's a kind of direct relationship between the more marginal you are, the more marginal your employment's going to be, because that's your way in. And that's one of the reasons that I got very interested in street markets. In Queen's Crescent, where this research was done, the latest research was done, small businesses are absolutely centrally the space in which migrants involve themselves. And they're very varied, actually. I mean, they're car repairs, they're clothing workshops, they're all these different kinds of spaces. But what's happened is they're sold off for redevelopment. And there's an interesting connection between sort of the level of the street and the level of above the street. And typically, people will be working on the street and living above it. But once you sell those two things off together, people don't just lose their work, they lose their housing. So regeneration is accompanied by also the growth of large retailers. And that, again, is a real problem, I think, because it leads to the growth of supermarkets. And when you have supermarkets, then it leads to a decline of small shops. It's a simple kind of relationship, which means that trading's threatened and street markets are in decline. So this is a sort of trend which we, I think, need to be aware of and thinking about change in relation to. And one of the kind of major things I've been involved with over the last 10 years as a sort of activist urbanist is to kind of try and get markets, as it were, secured in the urban landscape, because street markets are extremely important in the lives of migrants, both as places of what I call rubbing along, meeting people who are different, but also in terms of actually providing start-up businesses, providing networks, providing connections, and so on. Street markets in the British context are a very, very significant form of economic development for migrants. And again, regeneration is usually accompanied by gentrification. And Jan mentioned that point, particularly in relation to employment. But it's obviously incredibly important in terms of housing. New householders are pushed out of the lower rental market. In Britain, this is a real problem in some of the global cities. I think Berlin has a very different makeup to most European capital cities. I think if you look at places like London, the kind of whole push towards property development is having very serious consequences for migrants. So this is all quite a negative story. So let's go to what can happen, what's good. As you can see from this, this is a very lively street. It's very multicultural. And we have places like this all over London. I think rather different from Amsterdam, which is quite small. It's easier for Amsterdam to knock all these places off and put your lovely clothes shops as well. Actually, this would not be a street that would attract trendy hipsters. Very few people who are middle class would be shopping in a street like this. So it's a working class street. And it's a very interesting place to study, because what I found was, in this concept of making multiculturalism that I developed in this paper, was it seemed to me that what was going on was a kind of a local resolution. So the local people who lived there, some of the white people who lived in that area had fled the area, what's called white flight, but those that stayed seemed to me to have an incredibly interesting take. I interviewed both white traders and black traders, and we say black, sorry, but all sorts of different migrants in the area. And there were some very key figures in this street, one of which was the man who owned the grocer's shop at the end of the street. Now, this had been there since the 1950s, an old white working class family, what would traditionally be seen as a family that, a lot of the people who are anti-migrants would resemble this type of family in terms of class position. However, this man had made a very positive decision. He saw that the area had changed, and he decided to change his shop. So it went from being an old white working class type grocer to being this incredibly mixed shop. It sold for every single possible community, you know, every single possible spice, everything else, which is normally found in migrant-owned businesses. Now, the fact that he did this signalled to the rest of the street that there was an openness to change. And the fact that he did this led a whole other set of other changes in relation to the white working class response in that street, because he was a very respected figure. And I think that's a really interesting situation, because it speaks to the importance of certain individuals who collaborate or connect, if you like. So what I'm saying here is that connections between migrants and established locals, if they're successfully, as it were, encouraged, can lead to very positive outcomes, because in his case, he was able to sell lots of things. In the case of the people who'd moved into the street, they felt welcome in his shop. So those kinds of initiatives are very important. And alongside that, you have you can't really see from these pictures, actually. I thought I had a picture here, but you can't see it. But outside all these shops, you have these stalls that are built as part of the shop. And they're sort of subcontracted out to other people. So you don't just have the shop, which owns the space outside. You have the shop, which is one set of owners, and then you have the traders who, as it were, take an extension of the shop. And this is another way in which you can kind of encourage people into the street, because it's an opportunity to have a cheap bit of space. It's not quite the same as a market. It's a sort of quasi-shop, if you like. And these seem to be places where people could start their own businesses. So these kinds of, if you like, almost informal arrangements were making a big difference. So how do newcomers themselves shape the urban fabric? We were interested in this question. Where is it? Here we are. Well, I've just spoken about this idea of shops letting street traders attach their store to the shop. This is one very consistent pattern that you see across the kind of more working class neighbours in London. New community associations and youth projects and community gardens. I think you can't underestimate the importance of these kinds of small, and Hannah here is an expert on these sorts of things, so she can help fill you in on the Berlin story. But these kinds of small initiatives make an enormous difference. This was, as you can see, not a very big space. It got taken over for a community garden, and it became a place that brought people together. So it's a kind of bottom-up initiative, and it does something which connects into many people's lives. If you're from another country and you can't find something that you want to eat, then you'd grow it. This is, an obvious thing to be able to do. In places like this, people are given their own space, they can grow their own herbs and spices and so on and so forth. This makes people feel welcome and builds all sorts of social networks. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of these more sort of interstitial, liminal, marginal public spaces for building community cohesion and for building networks. Now, it's not without its problems. Funnily enough, I had quite an interesting conversation with the guy who's in charge of this community garden. He's Portuguese, and he was telling me about some of the Somalian women in the local community who loved the community garden from the point of view of having their own little space and all the rest of it, but they didn't understand the notion that they were supposed to be part of running the garden. So they had a huge argument about this, and gradually he made a kind of situation where people realised that there was to be collaboration. It wasn't just because they were used to things being given to them, because they'd been put into a very dependent relation as soon as they came to Britain, all these things being handed out. So the concept of being part of something was something that had to be built and generated. Obviously, there's sorry, I've taken a bit further here. all sorts of other ways in which the urban fabric is shaped. Mosques are very familiar, probably in Berlin too. They're often in houses and old shops and so on. Seems to me that seems a good idea to me. I mean, I can't see, there's objection to that, but certainly quite important. And then sort of interstitial spaces for informal meeting. And I interviewed this man called Chris, who was a tailor, and his shop became the centre for the local Turkish and Cypriot community. It was a shop that was for for repairing clothes, but he turned it into a sort of space of a cafe. So there was a sofa, there was this, there was that, and everybody came to him for advice. So these kind of informal spaces and they're not necessarily led from the top, they're led from the local community. What I would argue about all these kinds of things, all these kinds of initiatives, what does this mean in terms of local government? I think it actually means being flexible. I think it's sort of, let's not be too hung up about planning regulations. They're not always helpful. Health and safety, all these kinds of regulations can stop these kinds of initiatives actually flourishing. So, I think it's about flexibility, about openness and lack of formality, which makes it possible for these things to happen. In the suburbs, another place I did some work was, there's a lot of, migrants don't just live in centres of cities, they live in the suburbs. This is a pattern actually that's pretty constant, what's the word? You see it all over the place. I can't think of the word. You see it in Sydney and you see it in London, that there's a shift out from the inner city to the outer city. And this can be quite a challenge because those suburbs historically have been very white and seen as the preserve of the white, and they're now getting very mixed. And there's actually a lot of tension. The tension is that in those suburban areas, migrants tend to do different things with their dwellings. This was a paper I did with Onomik Saharts, published a couple of years ago. But what they do is they take dwellings and they extend them. They often build out the back. I'm sure that this would probably happen here. Quite commonly, there's a paving of the front garden. The front garden is seen as a mess. Therefore, you have to pave it and put your car. You decorate your railings and you build porches. Now, all these things cause contestation. They're complicated. They're not straightforward. They're things that people have to negotiate. What I would say about that is, it's a question of negotiation. It's a question of communication. It's a question of thinking through what does it mean if different, if you like, cultural repertoires, cultural tastes come into some kind of conflict. No easy answer, but something to think about. Again, something I think local planners and people involved in cultural regeneration need to think about. They're not straightforward questions, let's just say that. We call it ambivalent affect is produced in these. So there's the community garden. Well, this was a question that was on the programme. I mean, how do cities employ their possibilities to govern migration? I think it's quite hard to find positive stories. So I think there's an awful lot of restriction that's going on. So really, I think it comes to the local level. And I think that's the level at which there is really a possibility for change. It's possible, I found in my research in Queen's Crescent that the local initiatives were all very, very exciting. In schools, I think schools play a very, very important role in terms of the kinds of questions we're thinking about. Libraries, public libraries have become spaces where all sorts of initiatives for inclusion, for involvement, for networking and connection take place. Churches, a lot of the old Christian Anglican churches in Britain are now spaces of migrants. In fact, at least half the churches have been taken over by different kind of migrant groups. I think that's a really interesting shift. Obviously, community associations. And then basic stuff like we need representation. You can't have regeneration without representation of all the different parts of the community. And there the questions arise about who has the power to represent a community. And again, these are complicated questions. You know, you don't want a community just being represented by its men. you want women to have a voice. It's very difficult for women to have a voice in some of those societies because the women tend to be kept at home. So how do you deal with that? These are questions we need to be thinking about, I think, when we're thinking about migrant-led regeneration. So I put that there. This is one of the associations. And they realised, this group here, the Queen's President Community Association, saw that the market was in decline. They got together with all the different constituencies and they rebuilt the market in the space of 6 months. And it was a wonderful thing to see because it had been a market in decline. There they were, turning it around, introducing different foodstuffs, introducing different kinds of, all sorts of practices that hadn't been there before. So it can be done, but I think it requires energy and bottom-up planning. So I put here involvement of migrants in key organisations. I think it's important to involve people in, I'm just about to finish, in local organisations, involve people through the libraries, well, language, of course, is a huge issue. People, and especially women, actually are excluded. Older women are excluded by lack of language, consultation, and the support of new projects. Not just fixing on one or other as a solution, because it's always going to be different kinds of projects at different times that emerge, and you know, it's not. You can't come up with a kind of golden answer. It's going to be all sorts of different things. In this local area, it's the community garden, it's the city farm, it's youth project. In another area, it might be something completely different. And just to segue into something I'm doing research on at the moment, smart cities. It's a whole other story, but if you're going to have smart cities, you need to think about how does the digital include rather than exclude certain people, because it's in danger of reproducing more divisions if we don't pay attention to that. So just at the very end, there was the question about how we look at this kind of thing. I mean, and I was raving about this downstairs in Felicitas' office this morning, but when you've done all your statistical work and you've done all your interviews and your questionnaires and all the standard methods we use, I'd like to sort of just end with this nice little quote here from Les Back. And he says, what we need to do is cultivate a sociological sensibility which allows us to remark on what is otherwise passed over as unremarkable. And I think this is actually a really helpful thing to think about, because it's that kind of texture that we need to understand. It's the sort of texture of everyday life in its often unseen, hidden kinds of ways. And it means absorbing. It's almost like urban sociologists need to be anthropologists. It's a way of thinking. You have to absorb yourself in a place to really kind of fully understand it. And pay attention to the not so obvious. So it means different kinds of methods. Now, we all use these different methods now much more easily than I think when I was doing my PhD and before. But it's to say, let's think a little bit more sensitively to how we get beneath those dominant stories. And this is where I started talking. The dominant story is people don't like migrants. That's actually not the case. Most people living in cities get on fine with migrants. Actually, that's the case, and that is a shame that we can't, see that straight away. Therefore, you have to create other stories. You have to make other ways of presenting material. You have to fight in a way, fight the dominant story with your own small stories, and then I think we can see change happen that way.